For Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In January, I asked the question in the House about the hardship brought on by the closure of the Saskatchewan Transportation Company a year ago this month, and was encouraged when the Minister of Innovation replied, and I quote, "Mr. Speaker, as the member knows full well, this is an issue that we're working on. We will work with her office to make sure we take the appropriate steps that are required and needed to address the issue in a meaningful way," end quote. Having heard nothing from the Minister or anyone else in the government, I have sent a follow-up letter to the Minister on March 14th. Sadly, to this day, I still haven't heard nothing from the Minister of Innovation nor any other minister. Mr. Speaker, the loss of STC is keenly felt by many people in Saskatchewan. If you don't have the means to own a car or you cannot drive, STC was the only affordable means of transportation. Without it, people in Saskatchewan are forced into impractical and sometimes dangerous alternatives. Women seeking to get away from domestic violence or to attend medical procedures are hitchhiking to get support and health care. Further, many families weren't able to testify at the only missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls hearing in Saskatchewan. Last June, 7 women's organizations from Saskatchewan sent a joint letter to the Minister about the lack of public transportation for rural and remote locations in Saskatchewan. They are still waiting for a response. In March, at the United Nations Status of Women Commission session in New York, the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations was asked about the lack of response and promised to look into it. To date, these women's groups have not received a response. Mr. Speaker, if I may share a story which will illustrate for my honourable colleagues just how important it is to bring back STC. Just last week, a constituent of mine who works at a trade school was contacted by one of her students. He was in Prince Albert with no means to get to Saskatoon in time to start his final year of trade training. He wasn't able to find a ride, and even if he did, he didn't think he'd have enough money to pay for someone to drive him. This constituent of mine could not bear to stand by and do nothing while all the hard work that the student had put into his training is wasted should he fail to be present for his final weeks of training. So she decided to drive to Prince Albert to bring the student back to Saskatoon. This is what people with few means in Saskatchewan are forced to do, rely on the goodwill of others or the kindness of strangers. Saskatchewan has the second highest rural population per capita in Canada, and 70% of STC users were low income. 60% of those were women. In Canada, 1 in 5 people who use public transportation are living with a disability. Why is it that we see federal leadership, investment, and willingness to subsidize public transportation only in large urban centres? Public transportation is critical infrastructure in this country, linking rural and urban centres. It is a sustainable, cost-effective way to connect people to health care, to education, to employment, to family. It is a lifeline for Indigenous communities, and we need the federal government to lead the way. Why won't the government act on their words and work with me and my colleagues to ensure that there is safe, affordable, and reliable public transportation system in Saskatchewan? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And at the outset, I'd like to thank the honourable member for the advocacy on behalf of her constituents that she displays on a daily basis, and particularly with this particular issue. As the honourable member well knows, the Government of Canada, our government, is making unprecedented infrastructure investments in communities across the country under our long-term infrastructure plan, which totals more than $180 billion through our Investing in Canada infrastructure plan. Public transit infrastructure is a top priority for our government. These investments improve commutes, cut air pollution, and help grow our economy. Le Fonds pour l'infrastructure de transport en commun que nous...
This fund, which we launched within the framework of our infrastructure program, is based on improving transport systems across the country infrastructure. This will be millions of dollars for Saskatchewan.
15 projects in Saskatchewan worth more than $38 million. Ce financement a appuyé des projets comme...
This funding has helped them renew buses in Regina and improve the transit vehicles elsewhere.
Transit fleets across Saskatchewan, making public transit more accessible and reliable while reducing greenhouse gas emissions. As the member well knows, the Saskatchewan Transportation Company was a provincially run service, and the decision to terminate the service was made by the province. It is up to the provinces to decide how to best provide public transit services to their communities within their jurisdictions. It's a tenet that we all well know. The federal government has infrastructure programming available to support transit services and facilities. The Government of Canada does not actually operate the bus system, but the Government of Canada can invest in the physical assets that are required to support the bus system. There would need to be a proponent in Saskatchewan willing to bring forward that particular proposition. We're currently working closely with the province of Saskatchewan to finalize the new bilateral agreement for long-term funding under the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Plan, Mr. Speaker. For Saskatchewan residents, this will mean federal investments of just over $307 million in public transit, Mr. Speaker. Le gouvernement du Canada.
The Government of Canada recognises that local authorities are in the best position to know what the priorities are for their communities, and this is why we've been collaborating closely in order to support investments that will truly transform and have a positive impact on communities. We're determined to support provinces, territories, and Indigenous communities, and to work to improve infrastructure that Canadians need and use every day.
For Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague for his comments. Last Friday, I rose in this chamber to ask again what the government was doing, and the reply from the government was that they understand having an efficient and functional transportation system is absolutely critical. We need to work together. We have to work together with the provinces, with the municipalities in order to make that happen. And those kinds of discussions are underway, which was what my question was about. I believe in working together, and I do believe there is a role for the federal government to help lead the way with Saskatchewan residents when it comes to public transportation. That is what I had asked the minister, and that was my understanding, that the government was participating in looking at the Saskatchewan Transportation Company or a public transportation system outside the urban areas. It's been a year since STC shut down. I really would like to see the government step forward and provide a way forward and work with the province to find a way to have a good public transportation system, not just for urban people, but for everyone in the province of Saskatchewan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would encourage the member opposite to continue her advocacy on behalf of her constituents. That would include engaging the provincial government on this priority in particular. As she knows, the Government of Canada has made this public infrastructure, and as I reiterated earlier, an infrastructure a top priority. Through the first phase of our Investing in Canada plan, we've committed $29 million specifically to public transit systems in communities across the province of Saskatchewan. And for the next stage, as I mentioned earlier, of our long-term plan, we're working closely with Saskatchewan. We hope to finalize a new bilateral agreement which will commit the aforementioned sum of $307 million. I made the same mistake with 70. I just copied and pasted it. And it's $307 million, Mr. Speaker, to the province for their transit investment priorities. Le transport en commun est essentiel pour bâtir des collectivités.
Public transit is essential in building strong communities that are inclusive and green. The Government of Canada is resolved to support the construction of transit networks that are modern and efficient for the entire country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.